Jewish community. This is the Everett Center's 17th year. It was built through a generous donation by Edith Everett and her family to memorialize her husband, Henry. It was Edith's vision to create a Jewish denominational house with programs that would be free of charge and where rooms would be available to house guests. There are 5 bedrooms here to rent. For everybody who is new here, please come introduce yourself. We love having new people come in. Most of the volunteers have badges on, but feel free to say hello. Our program brochures are available over here and at the front entrance, so please feel free to take one. We're always looking for volunteers, and we also welcome ideas for future programming. Our programs are dependent on your donations. We don't get any money from the institution, and the gate fees do not support the Everett Center. Your tax-deductible gift helps the Everett Center make ours a home for Jewish thinkers and seekers from all streams of Judaism, as well as the greater community. It's our honor and mission to develop programs that spark curiosity, intellect, and imagination, infused with our rich Jewish culture and tradition. To continue our mission and to expand our program and strengthen our community, we invite you to make a donation so that we can continue to offer everything without charge. There are envelopes in the lobby, or you can make donations online. Lastly, you should know that there is significant security at Chautauqua, much of which is behind the scenes and is not visible to you. We all have a role to play. If you see anything that you feel is suspicious or bothersome, please let one of the ushers know or someone with a name tag.
That's good.
I just wanted to mention before I introduce the speaker that at 3:30 today, there is also another talk by Jeremy Ben-Ami, Anti-Semitism as a Political Tool. So if you want to join us for that, please feel free to. And again, that's at 3:30. The other announcement I wanted to make is that if you missed part of this lecture, you want to hear the lecture again, it is available on the Facebook page, but not on the Chautauqua.org site. So if you go to Facebook and search Everett Jewish Life Center, you will find it. Now, for our speaker today. David Greenberg is a professor of history and of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University. His latest book, John Lewis, A Life, here, has been called panoramic and richly insightful by Brent Staples of the New York Times, and a biography that captures Lewis's life, achievements, and times with heart-stopping precision. A Guggenheim Foundation, NEH, and Coleman Center Fellow, Greenberg is the author or editor of several books on American history and politics, including Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, and Republic of Spin, an Inside History of the American Presidency. Formerly acting editor of the New Republic and columnist for Slate, he now writes regularly for Politico, Liberties, and many other scholarly and popular publications like the New York Times or Wall Street Journal. He graduated from Yale University, summa cum laude, and earned his PhD from Columbia University. He lives in Manhattan with his wife, Suzanne, who you all heard speak yesterday, and 2 young adult children. I strongly recommend reading his book. It's great. I just started it last night, and there will be a book signing and books available for purchase after today's discussion in the front lobby when you just walk in the doors. And now, without further ado, here is David Greenberg.
Thank you, Miriam, and thanks everyone for coming. I want to thank everyone at the Everett Center, Arlene and Bobby and Joe, and Miriam and her husband Mark for hosting us. And it's terrific to see such a large crowd. Let me start with my slides here. Okay. As Miriam mentioned, I'm the proud author of a new biography of John Lewis. It was really a privilege and an honor to write this book. Really the most fulfilling experience I can say I've had as an author. And there's a great deal I could say about John Lewis, his life, his times, his journey from a farm boy in Jim Crow, Alabama to the halls of Congress. And in the question period, I'm sure there will be lots of things you may want to ask about him that I don't get to. Normally, in a talk, I kind of give an overview of the book, but today, given the setting, I thought I would focus in particular on his very special relationship with the Jewish community, and to some degree what it says about the trajectory of black-Jewish relations over the course of his lifetime. So there's a lot there, and we'll try to get through it in our 45 minutes and leave some time for questions. So just a week and a half ago, some of you may have seen a day of protest that was called in honor of John Lewis and the 5th anniversary of his passing. He died in July 2020. It was amidst the COVID pandemic, the post-George Floyd aftermath, the Trump-Biden 2020 election, a very turbulent time. And as that sign says, his good trouble, the slogan that he adopted late in life as kind of a social media hashtag, lives on. And it was pleasing to me to see that 5 years after his death, his legacy, his ideals, his person are still being invoked in the struggle for freedom and democracy. Lewis really was a kind of moral exemplar for a great deal of our lifetimes, from the civil rights struggles of the 1960s through the Trump era. We'll advance. So, I'll just do a little bit of a review. I think people are familiar with the broad contours of John Lewis's life and career, but it is actually quite shocking or amazing to think back when you realize just how young he was and just how central he was to so many key moments of that heyday of the civil rights movement from about 1960 to 1965. He's only 20 years old as a student at the American Baptist Theological Seminary when he becomes a leader in the sit-in movement that sweeps the South, where young black students, in some cases, particularly in Nashville, where he studied black and white students together, lead protests at downtown lunch counters to integrate the Woolworths and other department store dinettes where segregation had been the order of the day. And it was a dramatically successful campaign that not only began the road to desegregation, but also kind of captivated the nation. It helped spur then candidate John F. Kennedy to get behind the sit-in movement and the civil rights movement, and help bring about the progress that would come so rapidly in the next 5 years. The following year, he was a leader, and in the book I explain arguably the key leader in what were called the Freedom Rides, the effort to desegregate interstate bus travel across the South. And there you see his mugshot when he's arrested for simply riding with a white friend on a bus into Jackson, Mississippi. Then in 1963, he's the newly chosen president of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and in that role, the youngest speaker, just 23 years old, speaking to 250,000 people at the March on Washington. We, of course, remember Dr. King's glorious address from that day, but many of the headlines the next day focused on John Lewis's speech, which was kind of the most urgent, the most pressing, while the other speakers were making a case for passing Kennedy's newly introduced Civil Rights Bill, which would pass the following year in 1964 under Lyndon Johnson. It was John Lewis who took his occasion to point out the flaws, the holes, the limitations of that bill. It was a very hard-hitting, some even said militant speech, but one that was also tailored not to kind of dampen the ebullient mood of the day. And then, of course, people probably know him best as the leader in 1965 of the Selma campaign for voting rights. And on March 7th, 1965, what's become known as Bloody Sunday, John Lewis standing there next to Hosea Williams of the SCLC, which was Dr. King's organization, lead a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They're hoping to march on to Montgomery, the state capital of Alabama, as part of this voting rights protest. But soon, moments after this photograph is taken, they are set upon by George Wallace's state troopers. Lewis is beaten within an inch of his life, hospitalized, and that outburst of violence from the guardians of white supremacy in old Alabama is what galvanizes public opinion and political opinion in Washington to finally get behind the move toward the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which many historians argue is even more important than the 64 Civil Rights Act in helping to ensure black equality. So, ages 20 to 25, John Lewis is a leader, one of the key leaders in all of these momentous events. The book also takes you through the middle years, which I won't review here, but are full, I think, of some unexpected revelations. People kind of lost track of John Lewis in those years. But he goes on to a storied career in Congress where he becomes known as the conscience of the Congress, someone who speaks out with a moral register about the pressing issues of the day, and someone who can sort of help even his colleagues kind of figure out how to vote on difficult issues, that especially as he accrued seniority and stature, people would turn to him for guidance on how to come down on difficult political issues. I think John Lewis's life has a great deal to tell us about many, many things. I could talk about his lifelong commitment to nonviolence and the Gandhian teachings that he learned as a student in Nashville and in the movement. I could talk, and I will touch on a bit today, his unflagging commitment to a kind of interracial cooperation that he always saw as being at the heart of the movement for black equality. That he always felt it had to be a movement not of black people alone, but of blacks and whites, and indeed of all races. And he had an underlying commitment to a liberal racial universalism, which I think was born of political principles, of political liberalism, of his Christian beliefs in the dignity of every soul, and also in these Gandhian teachings, that they all kind of converged with this sort of universalistic conception of rights and freedoms. And I could also talk, and this too is a theme of the book, of his transition from protest to politics, as I call it, taking a page from Bayard Rustin, the great civil rights leader who was something of a mentor to John Lewis over the years, and helps John Lewis understand that as much as the very principled, often stubborn stands he could take as a protester had to give way to a more nuanced conception of progress if you enter the arena of electoral politics, as indeed he chose to do. So these are all themes we will see in John Lewis's life, but today, as I say, I'm talking about a slightly different theme, one that intersects, of course, about his particular relationship with the American Jewish community. I think John Lewis understood from very early on that the fights against racism and against anti-Semitism were really born of the same impulse, that there was that same kind of universalism of treating every individual equally, was kind of what undergirded these two struggles, and that they were intertwined from the early decades of the 20th century. In recent years, I think it has become somewhat fashionable to lament the rupture in black-Jewish relations, and certainly we can point to many episodes over the years where that once tight alliance has become strained. And more than that, I see in the academy a kind of historical revisionism that takes place that almost denies the importance of this relationship in the first place. But I think John Lewis's life belies that revisionist narrative and shows the continuing importance of the relationship between blacks and Jews, and shows that these fights are and continue to be, I think, at their truest underlying level, essentially the same fight. So I spent about 5 years writing John Lewis, A Life. I went to something like 40 archives, interviewed more than 400 people, one or two of whom may be here in the audience today, which is nice to see. Interviewed people from, his colleagues in the civil rights movement, some of whom you see up there, to his congressional staff, from his physician and his interior decorator, who knew John Lewis had an interior decorator, to Presidents Clinton and Obama and Hillary Clinton, and really tried to immerse myself in all I could learn and know about John Lewis. And even though I really only had the occasion to meet him once in person, and then during the pandemic, before his death, we did some phone interviews, but really my deep knowledge of him comes from all these other people who knew him so well, and creates this kind of illusion where I feel I could know how he was thinking at any given moment, even though I myself spent limited time with him. He has been called a saint, and this Time magazine cover actually goes back to 1975. He was called a saint even back then. And we can understand why. These kind of the surpassing capacity for forgiveness, for decency. He seemed to be someone who just, was not capable of hate. But make no mistake, my book is not intended to be, and I don't think it reads as hagiography. This is a book about John Lewis, warts and all. He's someone who at times made mistakes, made enemies, disappointed friends. As he grew into a skillful politician, he knew that meant making compromises at times, changing his position, sometimes even going negative, even against a friend, his good friend Julian Bond, when they campaigned against each other during his race for Congress in 1986. And yet, of course, on balance, this is, I have to say, an admiring portrait. Lewis was, throughout his life, a tireless warrior for justice, for racial justice, but, I'll stress again, also for other groups who he felt were being denied or kept out of the full promise of American life. So that meant for the poor, that meant for Mexican Americans, when he became very active in voting rights, their voting, their access to the ballot was a key priority for him. For gays and lesbians, even for trans people, for his Catholic constituents, but especially, I think, for the Jewish community, with whom he always professed a kind of special kinship that's really remarkable, which, as I say, is what I want to explore today. It's kind of a mystery, where this affinity came from. How did this, young black man born in dirt-poor rural Alabama under the boot of Jim Crow, where he had really no interaction with Jews, really very little interaction with whites until he was around 5 years old, come to be sort of feel such a bond and such an affinity with the Jewish people? Well, I see at least a couple of sources that he spoke about in interviews that were rooted in his childhood. One was the Black Baptist Church, which was very central to his family's life, his mother in particular, and to him. And he told an interviewer a couple decades back, I grew up hearing songs as a young child, saying, "Go down Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." And he said that he and his family, we could never erase that from his conscience. And then he said, we have an obligation, almost a mission, to look out for the children of Israel. And this was a deeply held religious conviction that he carried with him his whole life. There was also a kind of negative identification, you might say. At the age of 9 or 10, he recalled when he would visit Troy, Alabama, sort of the largest town or city near the farm where they lived. He said there was a department store called Rosenberg's, which I found a little wall sign for. And Rosenberg was, of course, a Jewish merchant. And he said that when he heard people talk about Rosenberg, and forgive my language here to quote, so I won't give you the full historical quote, he said, "I knew there was something wrong. When they said Jew, it sounded to me like saying nigger." That he could discern in the hostility, in the hate that was directed toward this one Jew or a small number of Jews in town, something very akin to what he was experiencing as a black person. And that was also something I think he kept with it, and he spoke about years later. As a young man, even in college, he's becomes fascinated by the story of the Holocaust. And he said, I get into discussions with some of my friends asking, how did this happen? How did people allow this to happen? I said to people over and over again, we must not allow a modern-day Holocaust to take place. So that experience, too, was something that seared him at an early formative age. So he gets to Nashville, and this is really kind of the birth of his political activism. I won't go into it, but in the book you see the seeds of it even in high school for John Lewis when he first hears Martin Luther King on the radio. But it's in Nashville that he falls under the tutelage, in particularly of two men. On the top there you see James Lawson, who was a divinity student at Vanderbilt, also steeped in these Gandhian teachings of satyagraha, of nonviolence that sort of became the watchword of the movement. And there on the lower left with Kelly Miller Smith, who was the leader of the local NAACP chapter, who was on the board of Martin Luther King's SCLC, and also shared these teachings and shared a belief in what was called the social gospel, a tradition of Christianity that believed in sort of applying its teachings to bettering the world. And here we see John Lewis being roughed up on one of these early sit-ins. And these Nashville years were important for many reasons, but it was then that he was actually first struck by the involvement of the Nashville Jewish community. I mean, for the most part, this was a very Christian movement, and Christian teachings, kind of synthesized, again, with Gandhian teachings, were central to it. But as kind of a support mechanism, lots of local community members, including, he noticed, the Jewish community, was sort of remarkably involved. This shouldn't necessarily have been a surprise to John Lewis, because in the history of the struggle for civil rights in the 20th century, Jews had been centrally involved from the very beginning. Joel Spingarn, the first picture there, was one of the founders of the NAACP. In 1954, the research that lay behind the sort of sociological debunking of separate but equal that helped overturn the Brown versus Board of Education ruling was funded, sponsored by the American Jewish Committee. There were many rabbis involved in the movement, from Joachim Prinz, who spoke at the March on Washington, to Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched at Selma. We also see here Patricia Wald, another early NAACP founder, Arnold Aronson, who founded the Conference on Civil Rights. That was really the key organization for passing some of that legislation. Jack Greenberg of the NAACP. So John Lewis shouldn't necessarily have been surprised or struck, but nonetheless he was, by this sort of deep historical connection of American Jews to the quest for African American civil rights. And then, one of my pictures is missing. Over on the left, I had a picture of David Halberstam. You must know his name, very accomplished journalist and author, who, as a young man, was on the Nashville Tennessean and covered those early sit-ins. And John Lewis took note that he was a Jewish man and that his interest and sympathy for the movement seemed somehow tied to his Jewish roots. Other journalists, he noticed, some of the most sympathetic ones, Calvin Trillin, who's still around, writing for the New Yorker, and elsewhere, covered the Freedom Rise for Time magazine. Then his close friend, Danny Lyon, who became SNCC's photographer, was a Jewish kid from Queens who really kind of threw himself into the work of SNCC. Danny Lyon was a great source for me on this book. He was John Lewis's roommate when Lewis headed SNCC in Atlanta in the mid-1960s. Went on to be a very famous photographer in his own right. And then, of course, sort of the Jewish involvement of volunteers on the Freedom Rides and Freedom Summer. In particular, Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, who, along with their colleague James Chaney, were cruelly murdered by white supremacists in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer of 1964, that important voting rights drive. And one of John Lewis's congressional staffers told me that he felt that people put their lives on the line, and by people, she was talking about Jewish people in particular, for something that they didn't have to. That's really what he felt like about the Jewish community. He felt a real kinship. And I think that, in particular, the murder of Goodman and Chaney and Schwerner really stayed with him. He became good friends with David Goodman, Andrew's brother, his whole life. And then this sort of affinity that he has, up through John Lewis's chairmanship, through the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, it's a fairly, let's say, uncontroversial relationship between blacks and Jews. It's right around the time that John Lewis leaves SNCC, and they turn in the direction of black power under the new leadership of Stokely Carmichael, that these fissures begin. Some people talk about it as a recent phenomenon, but you can see it there in 66, 67. Carmichael, some people kind of try to whitewash as simply, anti-Zionist. Someone who went to high school with him told me that in high school he remembered Stokely would go around telling the joke, "Why are Jewish noses so big? Because the air is free." So the anti-Semitism was something that Carmichael, came by as a young person and never really let go of. And again, I think I'm missing, I'm not quite sure why some of my slides that were, missing a photograph that was up there in that other corner. But the story here, in 1967, John Lewis had now left SNCC. There had been this big struggle the previous year. He had quit. Julian Bond had quit. Robert Moses had quit. Many of the great names we associate with SNCC had left as it went in this increasingly radical and racial separatist division. But John Lewis, being John Lewis, stayed friends with a great many of the people in SNCC. And the following summer he remained on the board of King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So he returned to Atlanta. He was actually spending a year living in New York, where he was sort of a fish out of water and would eventually return to Atlanta. But he's back for the summer, and it's just after the Six-Day War. And there's a real division in black opinion. Black leadership, people like Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, remain sort of staunchly pro-Israel, staunchly in support of the Jewish community. But as kind of a younger, more radical black movement develops, they get on board with a kind of international revolutionary politics. And up in his hotel room, Lewis gets in a big argument with two of his friends from SNCC, Willie Ricks and Stanley Wines. And I managed to get an oral history from a guy named Charles Johnson, who's an attorney in Atlanta, who was there in the room that he gave this account at the time. And he said it was really this knockdown, drag-out argument. SNCC had published for the first time a pamphlet that included, anti-Semitic kind of propaganda, language, imagery. Here you see kind of, the Jewish hand with the money, holding nooses around. I've seen different accounts of who that's supposed to be, Muhammad Ali or others. But, and the Palestinian liberation movement was sort of tied into this kind of global decolonization movement with which many blacks kind of identified, because there were many kind of left-wing, African anti-colonial movements also emerging at this time. And Lewis is saying to his friends, look, let's set aside the politics. Why is it necessary to alienate people? He's talking about Jewish supporters. He's talking about liberals in general. And Stanley Wise says, we formed alliances outside the country. We don't need to woo white Jewish liberals anymore. And they go back and forth. And this guy, Charles Johnson, said, Stanley Wise was giving this theory of international revolution, and John just couldn't take it. And I think that moment, it's related to his kind of departure from SNCC the previous year, which is also a knockdown, drag-out fight. It's a scene I tell fully in the book that you can read if you like. But these were just really formative experiences for him, and I think gave him a permanent distrust of this kind of hard left revolutionary politics, some of which seems to be gaining a foothold again today. Then we can kind of go through the years and sort of see the way that at different moments there are strains in the black-Jewish relationship, and Lewis often emerges as someone who makes it his mission to try to heal them. And he's someone who is trusted by both camps, if we can sort of reduce it to two simple camps, and who kind of uses his position to be a mediator, a healer, someone who tries to, mend rifts. One of the more famous incidents that some people may remember, when Andrew Young was the ambassador to the United Nations appointed by Jimmy Carter, he secretly agreed to a meeting with a PLO representative, sort of in defiance of Jimmy Carter's policy. And when this is revealed to the press, there's a lot of outrage, including, but not limited to, the Jewish community. Interestingly, Jewish leaders, and Andy Young had always had great relations with the Jewish community before. He would again as mayor. He mended his own fences. But there were a lot of people like Jesse Jackson who were kind of stoking the trouble and making mischief and sort of blaming. Anyway, Carter ends up firing Andrew Young for, in effect, as Carter says, lying to him. He's more sort of an acquiescence in a fib, but Young had acquiesced in a cover story that, he had just happened to run into this PLO representative rather than having set up a deliberate meeting, which was not in fact the case. So Carter fires Young, and Jesse Jackson and others say, basically, well, the Jews made him fire Andy Young, and it's a big rift. This Young had sort of been the highest ranking black cabinet official till that time. And John Lewis is the one who steps forward, who tries to reach out to black leaders, leaders in the Jewish community. He himself is working in the Carter administration at that time at an organization called Action, which was an umbrella group for the Peace Corps and Vista and other volunteer organizations. And I think that's a kind of early example of where he's performing that mending function. Over the years, he's active. He goes to APEC conferences. He works with the AJC and the ADL, kind of at the local level as well as the national. When Jesse Jackson runs for president, in 1984 and gets in trouble over anti-Semitic remarks. Lewis, who has put together in Atlanta a group called the Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition, they issue a clear-cut statement criticizing Jackson. And I should say Jackson had early on run afoul of Coretta Scott King, the King children, Julian Bond, the whole kind of Atlanta black civil rights establishment. They all felt Jackson was, a somewhat dishonest individual who would, try to kind of take King's mantle for himself. So there was a lot of suspicion of Jackson to begin with. At the same time, there was a lot of great regard for Walter Mondale, who was running that year and, of course, got the Democratic nomination. So they were all squarely in the Mondale camp in 1984. But, it says something that they were not afraid to call out Jackson for this. A few years later, in 1991, as part of the effort to kind of restart the Israeli-Palestinian peace process under George Bush Sr., there's the Bush administration commits to repealing a resolution that had passed 16 years earlier at the United Nations, equating Zionism with racism. And Lewis helps work on this repeal campaign, and he talks to African leaders and gets African nations on board. He's part of sort of the lobbying process to help repeal that notorious resolution. And then later, in the 90s, he's a leader in the legislation to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, which is something that a lot of people didn't think should be so controversial. But, of course, Palestinians who want to lay claim to a future capital in Jerusalem felt that it would obviate such an opportunity. And so people went through this fiction for many years of pretending that the Israeli capital was in Tel Aviv, even though, of course, all the government buildings are in Jerusalem. And finally, Bill Clinton signed it into law. It had bipartisan support in those days. Of course, it then, for pragmatic reasons, was constantly delayed because of the peace process, which, as you know, petered out around 2000, 2001, and never really was energetically revived. But there was always sort of the hope that that could be a bargaining chip one way or the other, and it was not until Donald Trump that it was eventually moved. But Lewis was interesting to see, someone who was really behind that legislation. Okay, sorry. Then, another key moment in the 1990s comes when Louis Farrakhan kind of oddly emerges as this leader for Black America. And, that may seem too grand a title to give to him. He certainly never had the unanimity of support that someone like Martin Luther King had. But it actually was quite shocking to see how many mainstream black leaders were willing to kind of welcome him into the fold. Farrakhan, who came out of the Nation of Islam, was overtly anti-Semitic. I mean, made no pretense. It's not like we can argue about it that someone said this is anti-Semitic. This was part of his ideology, and he was also overtly sexist, overtly homophobic. And yet, he was gaining a lot of popularity in putting together what he was calling the Million Man March. I don't think they eventually got 1 million people, but the idea was to have 1 million or hundreds of thousands of black men march together in Washington as a way of affirming black responsibility and sort of self-help for some of the problems that were afflicting, the black underclass, blacks in the inner city, drug use, unemployment, family dysfunction. And Lewis was getting a lot of pressure from his home district to support it. Even people like Rosa Parks gave their support to the Million Man March. But eventually Lewis decides to speak out against and takes a very principled stand, helped others in the Congressional Black Caucus come out against Farrakhan. Some marched with him, some didn't. It was a real rift. And I think for Lewis, it was twofold. I think on the one hand, he knew that his Jewish supporters, constituents back home, would feel a sense of betrayal. But he also saw Farrakhan's message, which was focused only on black people and was avowedly anti-white, as fundamentally inimical to that kind of universalism that I was talking about earlier. Interestingly, and again, here you see kind of John Lewis, the person, with a softer side. I interviewed his chief of staff at the time, a man named James Waller, who said, I understood his decision, but I actually wanted to go. And my father was coming down from Philadelphia, he was going to go, and I was afraid to bring it up. But I finally said to Mr. Lewis, I know you're against this march, you're against Mr. Farrakhan, but is it okay if I attend? And John Lewis said, of course. You should do what you feel is right. And afterward, Waller went to the march. After he came back to the office with some friends, and they sat around talking about it and sort of hashing out the issues, black and white congressional staffers together. And one of the staffers told me that was the kind of mood and environment that Lewis created in his office, where these kinds of things could be discussed, and you could see the legitimacy in someone else's opinion or point of view. For a number of years, and my time's getting short here, so I won't kind of run through this in great detail, but there are a number of controversies that, again, sort of put strain on the black-Jewish relationship. One of them was when Congressman John Boehner, then the majority leader, decides to invite Benjamin Netanyahu to speak to Congress, going behind the back of Barack Obama, the sitting president, of course, our first black president, to whom John Lewis and many African Americans felt deeply loyal. This was a difficult call. Should a number of Democratic members of Congress, some because they were protesting Netanyahu, but others more out of solidarity with Obama and seeing a slight to Obama, and also in some ways a slight to the black community in Boehner's gesture, decided to stay away. And Lewis, again, he's someone who goes to AIPAC conferences. He's not shy about being a supporter of Israel, but decides to stay away from the Netanyahu speech. So he's quite capable of kind of registering his dissent from Israeli policies or particular politicians when he sees fit. But he's continually trying to, again, bring peace. A few years ago, shortly before his death, there's a controversy over BDS, the move to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel, which a few of the more radical left members of the Democratic Party were advocating for. Lewis signs on a congressional resolution denouncing BDS as morally bankrupt. He has no truck with it at all. At the same time, he supports a second resolution affirming the right to boycott. And some people accuse him of kind of trying to have it both ways, but he was insisting that this was a matter of principle, that of course the boycott had been an important tool for black Americans, the Montgomery bus boycott and economic boycotts later on. And so he was going to support the right to boycott, but that didn't mean he was going to throw in his lot with this particular boycott. And he in fact created a new black-Jewish coalition or caucus in Congress in those late years. I'm not sure how well it's doing. Lewis's death, another woman, Brenda Lawrence, congresswoman from Michigan, was very active in it, has also left Congress. I'm not sure the state of it today, but it was an effort. There had been an informal black Jewish caucus that Lewis had led with people like Martin Frost, Howard Berman, Barney Frank in the 80s, that had actually been successful in helping convince Shimon Peres to end Israel's arms sales to South Africa, and in return, Congress, or Democrats promised, well, they wouldn't make hay of this in American domestic politics. So they were very good at actually working out these compromises in the past, and it's sort of a shame that he didn't live to help see the next iteration of that caucus through. So again, sort of from this final slide, this is from this earlier interview I talked about, where he's asked, kind of wrongly, because there is a sizable Jewish population in his Atlanta district, but he's asked, I'm assuming you don't have many Jewish constituents in your district, and he said, well, I have some, but if I didn't have any, my feeling would be the same. It's a very principled one. And I think that, is really a true summation of where these commitments come from. These principles that he talks about, again, nonviolence. He was always sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but rejected terrorism, violence, whether it was first the PLO or then Hamas as the avenue for achieving Palestinian autonomy or statehood. Again, the principle of toleration, this ability to understand viewpoints different from his own, to even, as hard as it may seem, to find love in his heart for his oppressors, whether they were the white segregationists of Jim Crow, Alabama, and Mississippi, or his, opponents across the aisle in Congress. I mean, he's a fierce critic and does battle with Newt Gingrich when, he and the Republicans take power in 1995. But again, then manages to sort of have friendly relations with many of these members of Congress. He would lead these annual marches over the Pettus Bridge in later years to commemorate the Selma beating and the fight for voting rights. And usually, of all the members of Congress he would bring with him, they were mostly Democrats, but when Republicans came, he always made special pains to make sure that they had a private place at the front of the line, that they could be there with their families, and he kind of looked after them. And people from Eric Cantor to Kevin McCarthy, after his death, talked with reverence about John Lewis's, deep feeling and regard for them. So there was toleration at a broad level and at a personal level. And again, this universalism, this idea that, we must treat each other the same in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of government, he would say in the eyes of God, without regard to race, nationality, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and so on. And that this was really an abiding principle for John Lewis. And so in sum, I think, this relationship he had with the Jewish community was rooted in, very important personal relationships in Atlanta, going back into the civil rights movement, but it also came from a set of ideals that was really at the heart of the movement, at least, in those early years, and I think remains, for most Americans, at the heart of their conception of civil rights, as well as at the heart of the values of the American Jewish community. And John Lewis had the insight and the emotional connection to recognize that affinity. So let me conclude there, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
If you would wait for the microphone so that the people outside can also hear you.
And again, I'm happy to take questions on other parts of the book too, besides what I've spoken about.
Yes, very interesting. I'm not a historian, but I would perhaps think that his relationship with the Jewish people may have begun with Rabbi Perry Nussbaum of Jackson, Mississippi, if you are aware of him. When the Freedom Riders were in the Parchment prison in Mississippi, he was the only clergy that would visit them, got food, he brought secret messages to them. They were not allowed to communicate with the freedom riders with their families. He went back and forth. And then when the rabbi started a movement of clergy in Jackson to rebuild the churches that had been burned, they had received no support, and ultimately Rabbi Nussbaum, his synagogue was bombed, as was his house. Unfortunately, he survived both. And I would think that his early support, and especially his visits to the freedom riders who were in isolation, perhaps the rabbi deserves a mention with the other Jews.
Yes, fair enough. I mean, as you described him, the man you're referring to comes back to me. That the name didn't at first ring a bell, but there were other rabbis who went on the freedom rides. The story of the freedom rides is really interesting. Once this group was getting jailed in Jackson, Mississippi, new waves of volunteers started coming down from all over the country, and these included a large number of representatives of the Jewish community from academia and clergy and so on. So yeah, there are a number of rabbis who played important roles in the movement at various junctures.
Right now, with the Israeli-Hamas war, I think that Black-Jewish relations are highly strained at the moment. And I'm wondering if you see any Black leaders today who are carrying John Lewis's mantle.
Oh, I think they very much are, and in some ways it's a shame because they're not always recognized as Black leaders as such, because we have many Black leaders, in a way that wasn't the case. But in Congress we see Hakeem Jeffries and Richie Torres and Gregory Meeks. These are all New Yorkers. These are congressmen I'm familiar with, but I think others too who have been quite outspoken. You have public figures, Van Jones, who's on CNN and has had a number of different political roles, has been quite remarkable in his kind of carrying this torch of what we might call the John Lewis position in various public statements, and often carrying it to audiences where it may not be always so wonderfully received. So I think it's still there. I think it takes the kind of effort that John Lewis would put into it. I mean, just to give one little story, with this Atlanta Black Jewish coalition that he put together with a handful of other Jewish leaders and Black leaders in Atlanta, they really would do kind of close on the ground work. One project they would do is they would bring in, like the NAACP would find a dozen Black high school kids, and the ADL would bring in a dozen Jewish kids, and they would get together for a weekend and have these deep sessions where they would talk and do workshops. One exercise is they would anonymously put into a hat questions they would have. Do you feel you're benefiting unfairly from affirmative action? Or why are you so obsessed with the Holocaust? And then they would pull it out and they would answer them. And I was told John Lewis would always come to these. He was a sitting congressman. He had lots of things he could be doing. And he would come there, sometimes in a tuxedo, having come from some gala, sometimes in a pair of jeans, and kind of sit, and listen and learn with everyone else. And his presence there kind of would help these kids feel like this is a very important and legitimate exercise that they were undertaking. So I think, and the Atlanta Black-Jewish relationships remain pretty strong. And so I think, public statements and public positions of politicians and spokesmen are important. But what's also important is the kind of on-the-ground work where a lot of the misunderstandings are dispelled, where differences are hashed out. Sometimes there are real differences that can't be easily reconciled, but at least you can, when you talk them out with a fellow human being, there can be less threatening or offensive than you're reading it, online or whatever.
Yes, would you and the lady that just asked the question explain for me the dynamics of the current schism?
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's a long time coming. It even in some ways goes back to that slide I showed from the 1967 conflict over the Six-Day War, and over a certain segment of the black community embracing a kind of revolutionary politics. And I think over the years, younger blacks, and especially more radical blacks in their politics, have come increasingly to identify with the Palestinian cause, whereas John Lewis and Andrew Young very much identified with the Jewish cause and the Israeli position. And I think as, for a variety of reasons that we could get into, there's sort of been, and this is no secret to anyone, the kind of left, which used to be divided but significantly pro-Israel, the left has turned very much anti-Israel. And I think that it's part of the same dynamic above all.
If I could push back on that, internally within the Jewish community, hasn't that already occurred?
Well, to some degree, but it's not the same. I mean, I think the segment of the Jewish community that adopts a kind of, radical anti-Israel politics remains pretty small, pretty fringe. I mean, they get more than equal time on the New York Times op-ed page, but they represent, some of the polls show 70, 80, large percentage of Americans have an identification, of American Jews have an identification with Israel. And Israel, I should say, really isn't the only issue, I think, behind this schism. In the 70s and 80s, more than now, but affirmative action was a source of division because many of the litigants in some of the early affirmative action cases were Jews who felt unfairly denied of places in Baki and medical school, or that, and some of the leading Jewish organizations, came out opposed to affirmative action. I think those positions probably changed over the years, but there were a series of political issues. Again, South Africa was another one. So where it wasn't simply about questions about Israel.
Any other questions? Our speaker is going to be signing books out front. If you could give him a lane so he can get out.
Right out in the front doorway. I can take this though.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Oh, thank you.
You don't have to think about
Which way are you going? Go around.
You have to watch this. Martha, you have to watch this. gonna go to the bathroom.
Hey, Joe. Almost as good as you look.
Yeah,